Hey guys, another video on budget surpluses. We've talked about the budget deficit being where government revenue exceeds or is less than government expenses. The opposite is true for a budget surplus. It is when government revenue exceeds government expenses. So what this means is that there are extra revenues available for the government, and we're going to see what the government does with the extra revenue that they don't use on expenses in this lecture. Now, before we go into the uses of funds derived from a budget surplus, we're going to see what a budget surplus actually means. So we know that a budget deficit is expansionary, so it stimulates aggregate demand. A budget surplus is typically contractionary. So it's a contractionary stance by the government. So even though if the previous year's budget surplus was larger than this year's budget surplus, we call that a sort of a lower or a becoming a less contractionary than previous years. It is not expansionary, but it is less contractionary. So it still is a contractionary stance, no matter what type of budget surplus it is relative to the previous years. It's either becoming less or more contractionary. So a contractionary stance means that it tries to slow aggregate demand, because possibly during this phase of the business cycle, the economy is at a peak or a boom, and so inflation is high, and therefore the government tries to slow down inflation in order to preserve our purchasing power. Okay, so now we're going to look at the uses of funds by the government when their tax revenue exceeds their government expenses. So firstly, what they could do is they could repay debt. So we know that the achievement of external stability means that our international financial commitments are met and that we're living within our means. And at the moment we have a net foreign debt of around 60 billion. That's a lot of money. But this debt is good because we're using it for productive purposes, so capital expenditure rather than paying off existing debt. So what the government could do with the surplus is to repay its part of its debt to its overseas lenders. And that's what it did between the years of 1996 and 2008. They use their budget surplus to pay off overseas debt. This is good for external stability because it makes our net borrowed debt more sustainable. Okay. And again, by decreasing their net foreign debt, this means their interest repayments also goes down. So interest repayments also decrease because we have less debt to pay interest on, and therefore this decreases the CAD. And again, that's another factor contributing to a movement towards external stability. So they could repay debt. Secondly, they could save with the RBA. So they could use the budget surplus to save with the RBA for a rainy day. So we're just going to put this in brackets, for a rainy day. So this is just a security issue. If they could save with the RBA, then in the future, should the government go into, or should the economy go into recession, then they wouldn't have any need to borrow overseas, borrow from the private sector and push up interest rates, or ask the RBA to print out more money. They could save it with the RBA, and then should the economy go into recession or go into a trough, then the government could use the saved funds from the RBA to stimulate the economy. So this is where the RBA could, the government builds up their savings with the RBA so as to finance budget deficits for a rainy day. Okay. And lastly, we have purposes of adding to balances of special savings funds. Adding to balances of special savings funds. And this all contributes to capital growth. So there are three funds at the moment that the government are trying to add savings to. Firstly, they have the Building Australia Fund. Australia Fund. Secondly, they have the Education Investment Fund. And lastly, or thirdly, they have the Health and Hospitals Fund. Hospitals Fund. What they could do with the budget surplus is to add to the balance of special savings funds to encourage economic growth, to be more sustainable, and to provide the public services needed to maximize our living standards, or to provide education, infrastructure, and health to those who don't have the money or don't have the capacity to pay for private education, health, or infrastructures. Okay, so it is hoped that the value of these savings will grow over time so that the government could invest. As we know, capital being one of the components of aggregate supply, capital growth would then increase aggregate supply, which would then increase the economic growth of Australia, so that it is both sustainable and strong. So it aligns with the goal of the government goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. So there are three uses the government has with a budget surplus. So they could either repay the existing debt, so as to lower their net foreign debt as well as their current account deficit. They could save with the RBA for a rainy day to fund for future budget deficits, or they could add to a pool of savings to fund for capital, health, and educational growth.